Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 7 of Organization Theory. Our reminder this week is probably the best one you're going to get all summer. There's no class next week for the July 4th week, so there's no lecture, no new reading materials to deal with. So hopefully you can get a little bit of recreation in and maybe also take a little bit of time to work on your culture projects. So again, we'll reconvene the week after next with the regular schedule. Our readings this week, we have one chapter again out of Rainey. That's chapter 11 on leadership, management roles, and organizational culture. So there's a bit of a high-level review of leadership theories. Organizational culture, obviously, that's been an overarching theme of this whole class. And so a little bit later in this lecture, I'll pull out some stuff from this chapter and talk about that a little bit and how it can relate to your projects. And then the other readings we have, we start getting into what's called the human resource theory or the organizational behavior perspective. So a couple of, I think, really fun, interesting readings. Mary Parker Follett's The Giving of Orders, and Elton Mayo talking about the Hawthorne experiment. So I'll say just a little bit about those, and then again we'll have opportunities later for you to delve into these a little bit in your critical assessments and in online discussions. I wanted to address, first of all, I really appreciate you participating in the question in the online Moodle forum last week, asking for some feedback, mid-course feedback on the class. So it was exactly what I was looking for, some good positive feedback that helps me know that at least hopefully most of the things are working well. But also there were a couple of things that seemed to be common themes across the three groups that you maybe wanted a little bit more clarification on. So one of those that seemed to come up a lot was contract grading, how things are going with that. So I recognize that this is a new approach to grading, a little bit uncomfortable, maybe not clear on what the expectations are. I guess in general, one of the things I would say is that part of the contract grading idea is that it changes your motivation away from producing results that will please me or get you a specific grade. Really puts the focus on your own learning motivation. And so I guess one of the things I would say is halfway through the course, I'm incredibly impressed with your motivation and the amount of work that you've been putting into the class globally, every one of you. And so that's good news in terms of, I feel good about where you all are at. One of the things I think I will do here over the next week or two is I will contact each of you individually, either probably through email, but we can do it other ways if you wish, just to talk a little bit about your individual engagement with the class, where you're at. I do go into all of the discussions. I don't respond to every discussion, but I'm reading them all, and I'm making notes of sort of the level and volume of contribution that all of you are making. And so I will provide some feedback on that. The bigger, I think, source of a little bit of angst and uncertainty is the culture projects. So I'll spend a little bit more time talking about those in this lecture. I guess one of the things I'd like to say is, again, I appreciate the fact that I didn't give you a lot of sort of benchmarks along the way. And so one of the things I think I may do is around the 10th week of the class, which would be the week of July 22nd in there, I may change the syllabus a little bit. And instead of having you do a critical assessment, I may have you provide some draft material from your work, share it out with everybody in the class, and then part of your work that week would be to provide some peer feedback to others in the class, and I can provide some feedback as well. So that's one way to provide a little bit of at least a touchstone along the way. So we're not waiting until the very end. I guess one of the other things that did come up a lot was sort of an interest in having sort of an outline of steps along the way. And I considered that obviously as part of the course design. One of the reasons I opted not to do that is I think in the real world, if you're doing this sort of a project, it's sort of on you to develop your own project plan and timeline and to be able to see a deadline and an output that you need at some point in the future, and then work backwards and figure out how you're going to meet that requirement. And so I'm putting a little bit of that on you for designing your process and sort of figuring out the time management part of it as well. I think there's some angst too, just in terms of how difficult this project is, and I fully recognize that. This is a great quote from the Rainey chapter this week. The task of developing an understanding of an organization's culture imposes a major challenge on managers and researchers alike. And so I fully recognize how difficult this project is, and I want you to know that I'm taking that into account. I have had one class that has done this project with just 8 students, but it did give me at least a kind of a benchmark of what to expect. I know, given the time that you have, sort of the level of expertise that you might have at this point, that you are not going to produce, sort of a full-blown, highly professional assessment of an organization's culture. But really what I want you to focus on here is not so much necessarily the final outcome, but again, the process and sort of the learning that goes along with that process. And so there were some questions about sort of how to go about this. Just a reminder, this is more or less the project as it's outlined in the syllabus. So these first 2 bullets are the bulk of the work. So mapping the roots of the program's culture. So that's the tasks, the resources, and the personnel that's part of it, and then the environment in which the organization operates. And so with the task, we're not just interested in necessarily what the organization does or what services it provides, but really paying attention to how the work is done, how decisions get made, how people work together within the organization, that sort of thing. I'll go into the resources and environment in a little bit more detail here in a minute. The second bullet, I think I'd like to rephrase this a little bit. I would say identify program commitments and then connect those commitments to the roots. And so these first 2 bullet points aren't necessarily in chronological order. As you are doing your soaking and poking, asking people questions, observing, those sorts of things, you may sort of start to understand what some of the organizational commitments are before you really understand fully the sort of the roots of those. But the whole idea of this project is to gather this information and then do some analysis to try to make a connection between those things. And then the third part of this project is identifying and talking about some strategies for how the organization could improve its culture. And one of the things that you might find is that the organization may already have identified some directions that they want to go in terms of cultural change, or they may have a strategic plan that has some very ambitious goals or sort of a new vision for where the organization is heading. And those are things that would require some culture change or result in culture change along the way. And so pay attention to those things. And if the organization is already in a place where they're thinking in that direction, you can certainly tie in this project to maybe sort of help use the Academian model in focusing on those roots and how a leader could address culture change through addressing the roots of the culture. If the organization has not sort of identified those things, it's up to you to do some of that identification of how you think that the organization could be a little bit more healthy and robust in its culture moving forward. I would remind you that in the Academian book on page 119, there is this nice list of questions that help guide your efforts to identify program commitments. A couple of things that I think this list can do if you scan through it. One, it helps you maybe sort of formulate the questions that you would ask, the kind of things that you're going to try to delve into when you're looking at an organization. And then it also, I think, focuses your attention to some degree on what you're listening for, what you're looking for. And so you'll see a lot of these, say, listen for the language that's used. So a lot of language that you're trying to pay attention to and look for some commonalities and some meaning behind that. There was, some asking in the, or some wishes in the last forum about maybe some examples. One of the things I thought I might share is a little bit of an example from my organization. And I think I have shared this earlier in the semester. This is a piece that came out of a University of Montana Information Technology Strategic Plan that was put together back in 2011, 2012. And one of the pieces of this strategy was specifically around sort of this vision of how the culture, we wanted to shift the culture within the IT organization. One of the things that I would say is that we're in 2019 now, which is just 1 year away from sort of this target vision. And not a lot has been changed within the IT organizational culture. We still really very much have sort of these commitments that are on the bottom left here. The commitment to efficiency, reliability, and consistency. So when you think about the tasks of the IT organization, it's a lot of it is around making sure that the network is working, that there are computing systems that allow people to do productive work, that there are learning technologies in classrooms and in laboratories that are always available and always working, so that when a faculty member walks in, hits a button, the technology works. And so you can really see where there is a lot of pressure on an organization like the one I work in to meet these commitments of being very reliable, having consistent systems so that people know how to operate within them. And I think when you think about making this cultural shift to the upper right, where IT is more of a partner and strategic partner, as it says here, has more of a leadership role, is more relevant to the overall mission and direction of the university, and that agility of being able to adapt more quickly to primarily the external environment that's going on. So, I think some of the things that you would maybe point to here is, how would the task change in making this shift? And so, obviously, there's new tasks in terms of relationship building and engagement of people in strategic thinking processes. That also ties in a little bit to affecting or impacting the culture and the environment that the university operates in, so that decision makers across campus, whether that is presidents, vice presidents, deans, directors, folks in management and leadership roles across campus, change their thinking about how they interact with IT as well. So there's again, both task and environment involved in sort of that leadership role as a culture change. The agility thing is, the environment that IT works in, not just the campus environment, but the external environment, the larger sort of ecosystem that we operate in, is having a tremendous impact. When you think about, the impact of mobile devices, people now, moving from sitting down at a desktop computer to, everybody having multiple mobile devices, typically smartphones, tablets, laptops, those sorts of things. It makes mobility important. It makes wireless connectivity really important. It also changes sort of how you deliver applications. One of the big changes that's happened externally is that there are a lot of vendors out there now who are providing services that had typically been provided inside the university's environment. And so that's both applications that may have at one time been coded and managed and maintained internally to now that same functionality is available. Buying a tool from a vendor, it's better, less expensive. But you think about that, and it significantly changes sort of the resources and the personnel skill sets that are required. So instead of having people who are programmers and systems administrators, you need people who are more application managers, people who have the ability to assess vendor capabilities and purchasing and contracts and those sorts of things. And so, I can say that our IT organization has, by necessity, done some of this, but it maybe has not been sort of as deliberate as it could have been, knowing even back in 2011, 2012, that these sort of changes were on the horizon, that they were creating the pressure to be more adaptive as an organization. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of what I'm looking for in terms of identifying the commitments, fairly simple commitments that an organization has, and then sort of tying those commitments to the specific tasks, personnel, resources, and environment. I did have a student in the spring who did tackle the Central University of Montana IT organization as a project. I was just going to share one page from her report. This was her sort of a way of going about identifying and depicting what the roots of the culture were on the left side, and then tying those to what she perceived to be some of the commitments in the organization on the right side. What I would say, one of the reasons I wanted to share this example was, not so much to look at the content, but to encourage you to think about drawing a picture. Whenever I see the word map, I try to think about that literally. A map is a picture that provides a whole lot of information, and it provides, in particular, really rich information about relationships. And what I think you can do is in drawing a picture or making a diagram, I think it helps in two ways. One, it helps you in your own thinking and your own analysis of the data and the information that you've collected. And then it also can provide a really powerful, simple communication tool out as well. So that, like I said, with a picture you can really depict some really strong information about relationships. And so I encourage you to do that. Whether you include that in your final report or just do it sort of as an exercise to help you, think through the content and the analysis. But I'd love to see some pictures in your reports down the road. So let's just say a couple of things about the readings for this week. I pulled this quote out of the Rainey chapter. I like it for a couple of reasons. And I'll read it here. No one has ever identified a common set of traits for excellent leaders. Leaders come in a variety of sizes, shapes, talents, and dispositions. So when I first read that, I really liked it because I do think that it's important to understand that a lot of different personality types and a lot of different dispositions can be really effective leaders. It's not just extroverts that are great leaders. Introverts can be great leaders as well. And so that's important. But as I thought about this a little bit more, I also wanted to challenge you a little bit to think about this. In your own thinking and in your own experience, have you sort of developed what you think are a common set of traits or behaviors or skill sets that you see in excellent leaders? And then secondly, as you're developing your own leadership skills and sort of mindset, you know, what are the common things that you're looking for? Are there some role models out there that you would draw from that sort of fit into your own particular personality and disposition? So, just a challenging question. This might show up on a discussion forum down the road, so think about it a little bit. I mentioned that the Rainey chapter this week has some conversation about, some discussion about organizational culture. You'll see Kadimian referenced in this chapter. There's a listing of 10 strategies for effective culture within an organization. I thought I would share these just briefly because, again, these offer you some clues, some guidance maybe in your culture projects, things to look for. So quickly, effective cultural organizational cultures. Leaders make it clear what they are monitoring, what they ignore, what they measure, what they control. So think about what that means, how you might sort of try to uncover that in your assessment of your organization. Effective cultures react to critical incidents and organizational crises in ways that send appropriate cultural messages. So dig a little bit into sort of how your organization behaves under stress, under crisis situations. That can tell you a lot about the culture and about the communication, trust levels, sort of preparation in advance. Third one is practicing deliberate role modeling, teaching, and coaching. And so what sort of emphasis is placed on the development of individual employees within the organization? Is it overall a learning organization, or is it a little bit stagnant in terms of developing skills and being adaptive to changes that need to happen? Effective cultures, they establish criteria for granting rewards and status, for selection and promotion of employees, and for dismissal or punishment. Some of these things may be a little bit more difficult to do in a public organization, but one of the things I'm going to share a little bit later in the semester is some examples from the Netflix culture. Netflix has sort of famously become a role model for how you very deliberately and transparently talk about the values and behaviors you expect from people. And one of the reasons that I think you'll see when we talk about that, one reason I think that it's very effective in Netflix and the Netflix organization is that they very much do use those values and the expected behavior in the sort of this rewards and promotion and how they hire and let go of people. And so a really strong example from the private sector, but it's something that we can take and adapt to public sector work as well. The next one is around coordinating organizational designs and structure with culture. And so the structure is important in the organization that you're looking at. What does that tell you about the culture? And then very closely related to that is the systems and the procedures that are in place. And so, again, some clues as to things you can look for, questions that you can formulate to try to uncover these sorts of aspects of your organization. Physical space is an important part of culture. Is it, again, deliberately done in terms of creating a positive cultural environment? I think one of the things that my student who worked on the IT organization this spring found was that our IT organization is scattered across multiple buildings on campus, and in many cases, the physical space is in basements of buildings or in former dorm rooms, those sorts of things, sort of leftover space. And it's interesting that, I mean, I think that does, um, it communicates a lot about sort of the value and the culture of the organization as to what kind of space is allocated to the organization by the larger, in this case, it's a subset of a larger organization. So take a look at that as you're engaged in the organizations you're working with. What does their space look like, and how does it communicate culture? Stories, I think, are really important too, and I think the Academian book recommends, again, listening for stories. Stories are an important way of sort of communicating expectations. They're really powerful as a leadership tool in terms of providing both a sort of a model for employees to follow, and sort of providing that inspirational, that emotional spark for, this is how we've traditionally done it. This is our founder's story, and why these values are important to the founder, that sort of thing. So listen for stories. Ask about stories that sort of capture the organization's culture. Look for formal statements of the organization's philosophy or creed, mission statements, vision statements, value statements, and those sorts of things. Most organizations probably have those, but then part of your challenge is to evaluate, are those just simply things that are shared publicly, or does the organization truly live by those that creed, that philosophy, that value that they talk about? And then finally, do they approach culture and leadership as a comprehensive organizational change thing? So again, are they deliberative about culture, or is it something that they don't really think about too much? I think one of the things that, again, relating back to the student who did the IT culture project, I think she probably found that people talked a little bit about IT culture, but never really sort of in the deliberative way. But having come into the organization and started asking about it, I know I hear much more discussion now among my colleagues about how we might change culture. And a lot of that was really sparked, I think, by this initial project. So know that your work in this project can have some really positive effects on the organizations you're engaged with. So a couple last slides, just one each on the two theories. The Giving of Orders by Mary Parker Follett. It's, I think, a really interesting look at a very early mid-1920s look at. It was very different. It was really challenging the sort of scientific management notions of the time. So I pulled out this quote that I think encapsulates the overall theme of the article. It says, "Our job is not to get people to obey orders, but how to devise methods by which we can best discover the order integral to a particular situation." And so what Follett was really getting at was for sort of the first thinking of participative decision making, and getting away from this idea of sort of that hierarchical authority, and the idea that a person at the higher level can give a command and expect it to be obeyed. That she really starts to uncover a little bit about human motivations and habits that are more complex human part of an organization, as opposed to thinking of people simply as a cog in a machine. So think about that as you read this. Think about how it applies to your organizations that you're working with, because I think a lot of organizations still sort of struggle with this concept that how do you actually engage people in collaborative decision making, participative decision making, and what is the value of actually approaching decision making in that way. Sort of related to that is the other reading on the Hawthorne experiment. So the Hawthorne experiment was a 5-year experiment that happened at the Hawthorne plant of the Western Electric Company. And so I'll let you read the details, but really what they were looking for is, could they change environmental factors? And if they did, would that improve the productivity of workers? And so really the interesting story of this is sort of the accidental discoveries that were made as part of the experiment over this period of time. So they would engage these participants pictured here in making some decisions about, what environmental factor would they change next, and then, they would spend several weeks with that factor in place and measure productivity among this group. So I'll let you read this quote, but I think, again, it's all about the impact of engaging people in the process of having some agency over their own decisions. This last sentence is, I think, critical. The group unquestionably develops a sense of participation in the critical determinations and becomes something of a social unit. So look for that in your organizations. Is there that sort of internal strength of teamwork and decision making that drives productivity sort of above and beyond what might be expected? Are people in the organization you're looking at sort of putting aside their own personal goals for more team and larger organizational goals? So some interesting readings this week. We'll be back talking to each other here in a couple of weeks, but I hope you enjoy your 4th of July week, and let me know if you have questions along the way. Thanks.